Detective William Kinderman had always thought silence was a gift. After a lifetime spent chasing murderers, cultists, and madmen, he believed that retirement would finally bring him peace, a silence he could wrap himself in like an old coat. But silence, as he was learning, had its own voice. It crept into his home after midnight, crawled along the walls like a spider, and sank its claws into his chest until it became unbearable. His wife, Claire, slept peacefully most nights, though even in her slumber, her breathing had grown shallow with age. Their house had become a museum of photographs, Kinderman and Claire on their wedding day, their daughter smiling at a long-forgotten birthday, and little Emily, his granddaughter, clutching a stuffed lamb with all the innocence of a child untouched by the world's cruelty. Yet, lately, even these photographs unsettled him. The smiles looked wrong somehow, frozen, as if the people he loved were already fading from him, becoming shadows of memory rather than flesh and blood. Kinderman sat at the kitchen table at 3 a.m, nursing a cup of cold coffee. His badge had long been surrendered, his gun sealed in a locked drawer, but old habits refused to die. Every night he replayed cases in his mind, the Gemini killer, the exorcism deaths, the horrors no sane man could speak aloud without being laughed into madness. He had thought he buried it all, but the silence was merciless. It made him remember. And it made him hear. The first time it happened, he told himself it was nothing. A trick of age. He had been sitting in that same chair, staring into the black windowpane, when he thought he heard whispering. Not outside. Not from Claire's bedroom. From inside the house itself. The voice was faint, guttural, curling through the air like smoke. He strained to listen, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Still, it left behind a coldness that seemed to linger in the pit of his stomach. Tonight, the whispering returned. Kinderman. The sound was distant, but he heard it. A name breathed with malice, echoing inside his ears though the house remained still. He rose to his feet, his joints stiff, his hands trembling as he searched for the source. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator. The soft tick of the clock. Claire's faint breathing in the next room. But when he turned back toward the table, his coffee cup was gone. It was there one moment, gone the next. He blinked hard, thinking perhaps he had carried it absent-mindedly to the sink, but no, the sink was empty. His hands began to shake harder. He rubbed his face, muttering to himself. You're losing it, Bill. Old man tricks. Memory slipping. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen too much to dismiss the impossible. The silence pressed down harder, suffocating, until the shrill cry of the telephone shattered it. The sudden sound nearly sent him to the floor. Heart pounding, he grabbed the receiver. Detective Kinderman. The voice on. The other end was tight, brittle. Male, mid-30s perhaps. Not a friend. Not family. It was the voice of a cop, one who hadn't yet learned to mask fear. This is Officer Gray from St. Dominic's Psychiatric Hospital. I'm sorry to call so late, sir, but Chief said you'd want to know. We've had an incident. Multiple, actually. 3 patients and a nurse. The killings are, well, they're exactly like the Gemini case. Sir, it's happening again. Kinderman's throat closed. The Gemini killer was dead. He'd seen the body himself, lifeless, cold in the morgue. The thought of the killings returning clawed at his gut like something alive. Officer, Kinderman rasped, his voice cracked from years of cigarettes and grief, the Gemini is gone. You're mistaken. But the officer wasn't convinced. You need to see for yourself. There's something off. Something wrong with one of our patients. The murders match, down to the detail no one outside the case should know. Kinderman felt the weight of silence shatter, replaced by the old, familiar dread he thought he'd buried decades ago. He should have hung up. Should have told them to find someone else. But he knew he couldn't. Evil had a way of finding him, of dragging him back into the dark. He hung up the phone and stood there, staring at the wall until Claire's soft voice broke the moment. "Bill? Who was that?" He turned, his wife's frail frame silhouetted in the doorway. For a moment, he considered lying. Telling her it was nothing, a wrong number, just a late-night drunk dialing the wrong house. But her eyes searched his, and she would know. She always knew. "Work," he muttered, though he hadn't worn a badge in years. She frowned, then nodded, as if she had expected this moment all along. She didn't press further. She simply whispered, "Don't stay gone too long," and retreated back to their bedroom. Kinderman remained at the table for a long while, the darkness pressing closer, the whisper of his name still lingering in the air. He knew, without a shred of doubt, that the silence he once thought he wanted had ended. Something had awakened again. And this time, it had called for him. The city was asleep when Detective William Kinderman climbed into the back of the police car. The streets of Georgetown rolled past in a blur of shadow and sodium lamps, the old brick buildings hunched together like conspirators. He had forgotten how much he hated this hour, the hour when the night was almost over, but dawn had not yet come. It was the hour of death, the priests had once told him. The hour when spirits moved freely, when the veil was at its thinnest. The young officer driving, Gray, kept glancing at Kinderman in the rearview mirror. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. He wanted to speak, wanted to ask questions, but fear strangled him into silence. Kinderman understood. Words had a way of making horrors real, and once spoken, they could never be taken back. St. Dominic's Psychiatric Hospital loomed like a fortress at the end of the street. A monolith of stone and shadow, its windows glowed faintly against the black sky, but there was nothing warm in that glow. It was the light of confinement, of sleepless nights, of walls that had absorbed too many screams. When Kinderman stepped out of the car, the air felt wrong. Too still. Too heavy. Even the wind seemed to avoid the building, skirting its edges as though afraid to touch it. Inside, the hospital reeked of antiseptic and despair. The halls were painted a dull green that peeled at the corners, exposing layers of older paint beneath, like scars refusing to fade. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with an irritating buzz, and every flicker seemed deliberate, as if the building itself were blinking at him. Officer Gray led the way, his voice low. The first body was found in Ward C. The nurse, Clara Wills. They said it looked exactly like Gemini's work. Carved symbols. Precision cuts. Kinderman grunted, his mind instantly replaying the crime scenes he had hoped to forget. The Gemini killer had been meticulous, ritualistic. He had sliced into his victims with the care of a surgeon and the devotion of a zealot. The thought of those same atrocities repeating after decades twisted Kinderman's gut. They passed a row of patient rooms. From within came the muffled sound of muttering, laughter, weeping. But what caught Kinderman's attention was the whispering. He slowed his step, straining to hear. It wasn't one voice, it was dozens, layered together, like a chorus of snakes hissing from behind the walls. He looked to Gray. "You hear that?" Gray frowned. "Hear what?" The whispers stopped instantly. Silence returned, heavier than before. Kinderman forced himself to keep walking. They reached a heavy steel door, guarded by two jittery orderlies. Gray fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling as he opened it. The stench hit Kinderman first. Blood, coppery and raw, mixed with disinfectant that could never truly erase it. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and in the center of it lay the body of Nurse Wills. Kinderman had seen thousands of corpses in his time, but this one stole his breath. Her arms were outstretched as though in mock crucifixion, her eyes wide and glassy, lips curled back in a silent scream. Her chest had been carved open with surgical precision, ribs exposed like the bars of a cage. Across her abdomen were symbols, familiar ones. The same ones he had seen 30 years ago. The Gemini's mark. Kinderman stumbled backward, clutching at the wall for support. His mind rejected it, screamed against the impossibility, but his eyes could not deny what was in front of him. A voice, smooth and mocking, cut through the air. "Do you like my work, detective?" Kinderman froze. The voice hadn't come from Gray, nor from the orderlies. It came from deeper within the ward. The shadows seemed to thicken as a figure stepped forward, flanked by 2 guards. He was an older man, emaciated, with hollow cheeks and eyes that gleamed far too bright for the body that contained them. His hands were cuffed, but his smile was unrestrained. Patient K. That was what the files would call him. No name, no history, just another forgotten soul in the asylum. But Kinderman knew better. The man leaned forward, his voice like silk dragged across glass. "It's been such a long time, William. You haven't aged well." Gray glanced nervously at Kinderman. "He's been asking for you. By name. Repeatedly." Kinderman's mouth was dry. "Who are you?" The man chuckled, a sound that made the fluorescent lights above flicker. "Names are tricky things, detective. They change. They decay. But you know me. You've always known me. Gemini. Legion. Call me what you like. We never finished our conversation, did we?" Kinderman's heart pounded. It was impossible. The Gemini was dead. And yet, the cadence, the inflection, the venom in every word, it was him. It was all of them. He forced steel into his voice. "The Gemini killer is gone. I saw him die." The man's smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp, too perfect. "Death is only a door. And you, William, have left it wide open." The lights above them burst with a sharp crack, plunging the room into darkness. In that instant, the whispers returned, louder, closer, surrounding them. The sound wasn't coming from the patients. It was in the walls. In the air. In Kinderman's head. "Kinderman. Join us. It's beginning." When the emergency lights flickered on, Patient K was still smiling, his eyes gleaming with something not entirely human. Kinderman staggered back, his chest tight, the world spinning. He knew then, without question, that the silence was over. The evil that had once possessed a child in Georgetown, that had worn the skin of the Gemini killer, that had haunted him for decades, it had returned. And it was waiting. Kinderman didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk with a cigarette trembling between his fingers, staring at the case files scattered in front of him. The words blurred together, names, times, autopsies, but one image refused to fade, the nurse's body splayed open, carved with Gemini's mark. The Gemini was dead. He had been executed years ago. Kinderman had stood in the room when the switch was thrown, had watched the body convulse under the electric current, had seen the life leave those hateful eyes. Yet here it was again, resurrected in blood and precision. And then there was Patient K. His voice, his mannerisms, it was too exact, too cruel to be coincidence. At 3:15 a.m., the phone rang. The same cursed hour. Kinderman nearly dropped the receiver as he picked it up. A low, crackling silence greeted him before a voice spoke, smooth, mocking, unmistakable. "Still awake, William? We never sleep, you and I. Not anymore." Kinderman's blood ran cold. "How did you get this number?" The voice chuckled. "Numbers. Walls. Keys. Locks. Such fragile things. Did you think they could contain me?" And then, static, whispers, laughter. The line went dead. The following morning, Kinderman returned to St. Dominic's with renewed dread. Patient K was kept in the high-security ward, behind reinforced glass. The room was bare, a cot, a metal chair, chains bolted to the floor. And there he sat, hands folded neatly, like a parishioner waiting for confession. When Kinderman entered, Patient K lifted his head and smiled. "Detective," he drawled. "You look tired. The dead tend to do that to a man." Kinderman pulled a chair across the floor, the scrape echoing in the sterile chamber. He sat down, forcing his voice to stay level. "I want answers. Who are you?" Patient K tilted his head, studying him like a specimen. "Do you remember the girl, William? The sweet child, 12 years old, with a demon coiled inside her like a serpent?" Kinderman's chest tightened. He remembered Reagan McNeil. He remembered Father Karras' sacrifice. Patient K's smile widened. "I was there. In the room. Watching through her eyes, speaking through her tongue. I felt the priest's bones break when we cast him from the window." Kinderman slammed his fist against the table. "Enough. You're lying. You're just some lunatic who's read too many headlines." The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Then explain this, William. How did the Gemini's father die?" Kinderman froze. That detail had never been released to the press. Only the killer had known, and the detective who had caught him. Patient K's grin turned into a sneer. "Hanging, William. Hung like the dog he was. His tongue swollen, his eyes bulging. The Gemini laughed as he cut him down. And I laughed too, because I was there. I am always there." Kinderman's hands shook. Sweat prickled the back of his neck. "You can't be him," he whispered. The man's eyes gleamed with something more than madness. Something ancient. "I am not him. I am Legion. Many in one. We are the swarm in the dark, the hunger between breaths, the silence before the scream. The Gemini was merely a mask I wore. Just as Karras was. Just as this pitiful shell is now." As he spoke, the lights in the room flickered. The air grew colder, heavy with an invisible weight. Behind Kinderman, the guards shifted uneasily. One crossed himself. Patient K leaned back, satisfied. "You feel it, don't you? The truth. We never left, William. We lingered in the corners of your life, waiting. And now, the door is open again." Kinderman forced himself to stand. His voice cracked despite himself. "If you're Legion, if you're what you claim, then what do you want?" The smile sharpened into something wolfish. "We want you to remember. We want you to suffer. And when the world drowns in silence again, we want you to watch." That night, the hospital stirred with unease. Nurses swore they heard footsteps in empty corridors. Patients screamed in unison, though none could recall why. Security cameras caught flickers of shadows moving against the grain of the light, shapes that didn't belong to any living body. Kinderman stayed late, reviewing tapes, his nerves fraying with every whisper of static. In one clip, taken outside Patient K's cell, he saw something that nearly drove him mad. For one frame, one impossible, undeniable frame, the face on the monitor was not Patient K's. It was Damien Karras. Bloodied, broken, his eyes wide with suffering. And behind him, dozens of faces, overlapping, shifting, whispering. Legion. The following morning, a priest arrived at St. Dominic's. Father Paul Morning, young, gaunt, with eyes that burned with a quiet faith. He had heard rumors of what stirred in the ward, and he came uninvited. Kinderman found him kneeling in the chapel, whispering prayers into the dim air. "You shouldn't be here," Kinderman said. "This isn't your fight." The priest looked up, his expression unwavering. "If what you say is true, detective, then it's everyone's fight." Kinderman shook his head. "You don't understand. This thing, it doesn't just kill. It twists. It breaks people from the inside. It wears them." Father Morning tightened his grip on the rosary. "Then it can be cast out." Kinderman wanted to laugh, wanted to shout, wanted to believe. But all he could hear was Legion's voice, whispering in the back of his skull. You can't stop us. We are many. We are already inside. As if to prove the point, a scream shattered the quiet. It came from Ward C. Kinderman and the priest ran, their footsteps echoing down the hall. When they arrived, the orderlies were already gathered outside a patient's room, pale and trembling. Inside, a young woman was thrashing against her bed restraints, eyes rolling back, foam at her lips. Her voice, when it came, was not her own. Ilium. The air grew heavy, vibrating with something unseen. The girl's body. Bent at unnatural angles, her jaw snapping open wider than it should have. Her screams turned into laughter, Legion's laughter. And in that moment, Kinderman knew the truth. This wasn't just about patient K. Legion was loose. And the hospital itself had become its hunting ground. The nights were no longer restful. Even in his retirement, Detective William Kinderman had once found comfort in small rituals, the evening whiskey, the muted chatter of a late-night news anchor, the soft rattle of wind against the glass. But now, each night seemed heavier than the last, saturated with a silence that throbbed like a wound. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it brought dreams that were not his own. Dreams of incense smoke curling in suffocating coils, of Latin phrases spilling from lips cracked with exhaustion, of eyes that glowed yellow in the dark. Sometimes he heard screams muffled as though through thick walls. Sometimes he saw Father Marin's hands trembling, gripping a crucifix until blood seeped from his knuckles. Kinderman woke from these nightmares drenched in sweat, his breath ragged. He would stumble into his kitchen, pour water, and whisper to himself, "It's just memory. Just memory." Yet he had never witnessed those events. He had never stood inside the Georgetown bedroom where the most infamous exorcism had been waged. He had only read files, seen crime scene photos, pieced together fragments of testimony. And yet, the dreams were vivid, too vivid, as if the walls of time had been peeled back for him to see. The hospital was no escape. Its halls seemed to absorb his dread, amplifying it with each visit. By now, every corner, every muted conversation with a nurse, felt stained with menace. Patients muttered nonsense when he passed, though sometimes the nonsense made sense if he listened closely enough. Once, a woman who had been catatonic for years suddenly rasped, "He's calling you, detective. He remembers your smell." Then she fell silent, unresponsive again, as though her body had been briefly borrowed for the message. Cell 11 was the heart of it all. The patient inside had no name in the records, only a number. Yet when Kinderman stepped into that room, the air always grew heavier, thick with something unseen. This time, the man was not slumped against the wall as before. He sat upright, eyes fixed on the detective. The pupils dilated unnaturally, so wide they nearly swallowed the irises. A faint smile touched his lips. "Tell me, William," the man said, his voice soft but resonant, "do you believe in déjà vu?" Kinderman swallowed. He kept his notebook in hand, though he hadn't written anything down for days. "I believe in memory," he replied. The smile widened. "Memory, yes. But not all memory is your own. Sometimes, it is given." "Given by who?" The patient leaned forward, his face inches from the dim light above. His skin looked wrong, too thin, almost translucent, like parchment stretched across bone. His breath smelled faintly of rot. "By those who have walked before you. By the ones who burned in the fire of faith. You see Marin, don't you? You see him suffer. His prayers echo in you." Kinderman froze. His chest tightened. "How do you know that?" The man chuckled. It was not human laughter. It carried with it the sound of rusted hinges, of insects crawling over one another in a jar. "Because I was there. I was in that room. I whispered to the girl as she screamed. I watched as Marin's heart gave out under my hand. The detective's grip on his pen faltered. His mind screamed no. This is a game, just a game. But deep inside, something cracked. The patient, Pazuzu, if his claim were true, tilted his head. You wonder why you dream of him. It's simple. You are being prepared, William. His faith failed. Yours will too. The lights above flickered. For a moment, the man's face changed. Wrinkles deepened, his eyes sank into sockets dark as pits, and another face shimmered over his. Marin's. The priest's mouth opened, his final gasp repeated like a loop, God, help. Then the visage was gone, replaced by the hollow grin of the patient. Kinderman stumbled backward, slamming against the wall. His notebook hit the floor with a dull slap. You bastard, he whispered, his voice trembling. The man in cell 11 leaned back, casual, as though nothing had happened. Bastard? No, William. Father. I am the father of despair. I am the bloodline that runs through this hospital, through your veins, through your family. I touch every cradle. I whisper into every ear. Even now. Kinderman's thoughts went to Emily. His granddaughter's laugh, her innocent eyes. For a fleeting second, he thought he heard her voice outside the cell, calling, faint, like a lost child, Grandpa. His chest constricted. What did you say about my family? But the man's eyes rolled back, his mouth gaped, and he slumped once again into silence, as if the energy had been spent. Catatonic. Still. The detective staggered out of the room, fighting to steady his breath. The guard looked at him strangely. You all right, sir? Kinderman didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat felt raw, his mind burning with Marin's fading eyes. That night, as he tried to write a report, the pen wouldn't stop shaking in his hand. Every time he put words to paper, the letters distorted, rearranging themselves into one word, Marin. He dropped the pen, clutched his face, and whispered to the empty room, God, what am I walking into? Hospitals had always unsettled Detective William Kinderman, but now, Georgetown Memorial felt less like a sanctuary of healing and more like a tomb with fluorescent lights. Every hallway hummed with unseen pressure, every ceiling panel seemed to whisper. It wasn't just the murders, the whispers from cell 11, or even the nightmares of Father Marin. No, the building itself was changing, bending into something unnatural. He noticed it first in the smallest details. A crucifix on the wall of the hospital chapel had been turned upside down during the night, though no one claimed responsibility. Prayer candles burned longer than they should have, wax dripping in strange patterns like twisting faces. A nun collapsed during Mass, convulsing, her lips foaming as she hissed a guttural language no one recognized. When the doctors checked her pulse, she was alive, but her pupils were blown wide, as though staring into a blackness beyond the room. Nurses whispered to one another in the break rooms. Some reported waking at night with bruises on their wrists, as though hands had gripped them tightly while they slept. Others said they felt watched while doing their rounds, their shadows moving independently of their bodies. A young orderly quit on the spot after swearing he heard someone breathe directly into his ear, even though no one was behind him. The fear was contagious. Kinderman walked through the ward, notebook in hand, though writing had become pointless. Every page filled itself with the same word, Marin. Sometimes, letters twisted into shapes that weren't words at all, ancient sigils he couldn't understand but instinctively feared. On the third floor, he found blood streaked across the wall near the ICU. The stain looked like a handprint, but stretched too long, the fingers grotesquely elongated. When he asked the cleaning staff, they swore it had appeared overnight. One janitor muttered, the walls. They bleed sometimes. You'll see. Kinderman dismissed it aloud, but in his heart, he knew it wasn't imagination. That evening, the detective returned to cell 11. He told himself it was to gather evidence, to confront the delusion head-on. But the truth was, he felt drawn, pulled like a moth to flame. The patient sat in the shadows again, his back hunched, his face obscured. Yet when Kinderman entered, the man's lips curled in a grin as though he had been waiting. "You smell it now, don't you, William? The rot spreading through these walls." Kinderman clenched his fists. "What's happening to this hospital?" The man leaned forward. "It is no longer a hospital. It is a breeding ground. Every soul here is fertile soil, every fear a seed. Soon, they will blossom." As if on cue, a scream tore down the hall, high-pitched, shrill, unrelenting. Kinderman spun around, rushing toward the noise. He found a young patient thrashing in bed, her body arching unnaturally, vertebrae cracking as though pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes rolled back, foam spilling from her mouth. Nurses swarmed around her, trying to hold her down. But what made Kinderman freeze was her voice. In the middle of her convulsions, she whispered in a perfect, rasping imitation of Father Marin, "God, help." The same words from his nightmares. The same dying plea. The patient collapsed suddenly, limp, as though the performance were over. Machines beeped erratically, then steadied. She was alive. Breathing. But her eyes were wide open, fixed on Kinderman, and she whispered, barely audible, "You can't stop us." Word of these incidents spread quickly, but the administration insisted on silence. Mass hysteria, they called it. Stress, paranoia, collective delusion. They locked records, forbade staff from speaking to press, and demanded the detective submit his notes through proper channels. But Kinderman wasn't fooled. He could see the fear in their eyes. He could hear the whispers when they thought no one was listening. Some of the staff prayed openly now, rosaries clutched in trembling hands. Others stopped showing up entirely. And then came the night of the blackout. At 2:17 a.m., the power surged and failed, plunging the entire hospital into suffocating darkness. Generators stuttered to life, but the lights flickered weakly, throwing the halls into jerking shadows. Alarms blared in different wings, machines powered down, and the air itself seemed to thrum. Kinderman, flashlight in hand, made his way through the corridors. Patients moaned in their rooms, some screaming as though attacked by unseen assailants. The detective swore he saw figures darting in the periphery, long-limbed silhouettes skittering across ceilings, vanishing when the light caught them. He rounded a corner and nearly dropped his light. There, in the pediatric ward, every toy had been arranged into a grotesque display. Dolls hung from 4 poles by their necks. Stuffed animals had been torn open, their insides smeared across walls in crude crosses. And on the glass wall of the playroom, written in something thick and dark, were the words, "She is waiting." Kinderman stumbled back, his pulse hammering. The air grew colder. A sound rose behind him, not footsteps, but the rhythmic scrape of something dragging across tile. He turned, and in the weak flashlight beam, he saw a figure at the end of the hall. It looked like a nurse, but her head lolled at an unnatural angle, her jaw unhinged too wide, drool and blood spilling freely. She twitched violently, like a marionette pulled by cruel strings. Then, with a shriek that didn't belong in a human throat, she bolted toward him. Kinderman barely had time to react. He swung the flashlight, the beam stuttering across her distorted face, and she was gone. The hall was empty, silent again, as though nothing had happened. His breath came in ragged gasps. He backed away slowly, gripping the wall for balance. The darkness pressed in tighter, oppressive. Suffocating. And then he heard it, dozens of whispers, layered atop one another, crawling through the air like insects in his ears. Some were prayers. Some were screams. Some were simply his name, over and over, William. 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 The detective collapsed against the wall, covering his ears, but the voices seeped inside his skull. For a terrible moment, he thought he saw every patient in every room rise from their beds, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, all mouthing the same word in unison. Marin. The blackout ended suddenly. Lights flared, alarms reset, and silence fell. The hospital was normal again. Nurses ran about, checking machines, assuring patients. No one else seemed to have seen what he had. But Kinderman knew. The hospital wasn't sick. It wasn't cursed. It was becoming. The detective returned home at dawn, his body trembling, his mind fractured. He stared at himself in the mirror, and for just an instant, his reflection didn't move with him. Its mouth twitched upward into a grin he didn't wear. And from behind his own eyes, he heard a voice that was not his own, whispering gently, patiently. "Soon, William. Soon, we'll finish what Marin could not." The city had been drowning in rain for days, the streets slick with filth and water, neon signs smearing across the asphalt like bleeding wounds. Kinderman sat in his kitchen at 3 a.m, the apartment swallowed in a hush that was never peaceful. His coffee had gone cold long before he realized he wasn't drinking it. His hands trembled slightly, the aftershock of too many sleepless nights and too many voices echoing in his head. On the table lay a folder thick with photographs. He kept staring at one in particular, a young nurse from the hospital, her throat torn wide open, her face frozen in horror. Her eyes were gouged out, the sockets black pits. She had been found in the very corridor where Kinderman swore he had seen shadows moving without light. The demon's work, he could feel it. But tonight, something heavier pressed against him, an unspoken dread that gnawed at his gut. It was the way the demon had smiled when it mentioned family. He had tried to shake it off, convincing himself it was just another taunt. But the thought lingered like rot. The sound of laughter broke the silence. High-pitched. Small. Innocent. He froze. It wasn't coming from outside, it was in his apartment. He rose slowly, his bones aching, his pulse clawing up his throat. The laughter floated down the hallway, toward the room where his granddaughter, Emily, often stayed when she visited. But she wasn't supposed to be there tonight. His daughter had taken her home hours ago. Emily. His voice was fragile, breaking the dark. No answer. Just the soft thump of little feet running across the wooden floor. Kinderman moved toward the sound, every step tightening the vice around his chest. The door to the room stood ajar, darkness pooling inside. He pushed it open. The smell hit him first, stale, sour, a hint of rot beneath lavender perfume. Emily sat on the bed. Her small frame was rigid, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide open and reflecting a glimmer of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. At first, he almost wept with relief. But then she smiled. It was not her smile. The lips cracked wide, too wide, skin splitting faintly at the corners. Her teeth gleamed sharp in the dark. And when she spoke, the voice was layered, childlike sweetness warped by a guttural growl that clawed through the words. "Grandpa." He staggered back, shaking his head violently. "No. No, no, no." She rose from the bed, every movement stiff, jerky, like a puppet tugged on broken strings. "He's been waiting for me. He says I'm special. He says my blood tastes like yours." The words scraped through him like barbed wire. He felt the floor sway beneath his feet, reality bending. The demon hadn't just wanted to torment him, it wanted to carve its way into his bloodline. Emily's body convulsed suddenly, her small frame jerking violently before slamming against the wall. Her head snapped back with a crack, but she didn't fall. Instead, she stood, her face distorted in a grotesque grin. Her eyes, once warm and brown, were black voids crawling with faint slithering shapes. "You couldn't save Marin." The voice that came from her was deeper now, a guttural thunder that rattled the walls. "You couldn't save Karas. And you will not save her. Stop it." Kinderman's voice broke, his tears burning hot. "She's just a child, leave her." Emily tilted her head, her neck twisting until the sound of tendons snapping filled the room. Her small hands dug into her own stomach, nails raking across skin until blood seeped down her nightdress. But she didn't flinch. She giggled, her mouth slick with crimson. "Grandpa, do you love me?" she whispered, the voice shifting back to her innocent tone. Kinderman felt his knees weaken, the bile rising in his throat. "Yes, God, yes, more than anything." "Then pray harder." Her body lurched forward in a blur of speed, her tiny hands slamming against his chest with a force that should have been impossible. He stumbled backward, colliding with the hallway wall, gasping for breath. The laughter that poured from her lips was no longer Emily's, it was the same echo he had heard in cell 11, the same endless mocking tone. For the first time in his long, weary life, Kinderman felt his faith collapsing into dust. The next morning, Father Andrews found him sitting on the floor outside the room, his face gray, his hands shaking. He had locked the door, refusing to go back in, but he could hear her inside, whispering to herself in voices that didn't belong to a child. "She's gone," Kinderman rasped, his eyes hollow. "She's gone, and it's my fault." The priest's expression was grim, but resolute. "No. She's not gone yet. This is what the demon wants you to believe. It thrives on despair. If you give in, she's his forever." Kinderman looked up, his tears reflecting the morning light. "I can't lose her. She's all I have left." Father Andrews placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we fight. Together." That night, as thunder cracked across the city, Kinderman stood once again inside the psychiatric hospital. Emily was brought in under the guise of medical emergency, strapped to a bed in a secluded wing. Her small body writhed, her voice rising in guttural chants that made the lights flicker and the walls groan. Doctors and nurses had fled the room hours earlier, muttering prayers under their breath as they abandoned their posts. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with a stench that clung to the skin. Father Andrews prepared his holy water, his Bible trembling in his hands. Kinderman stayed near the doorway, torn between terror and the urge to rush to Emily's side. The demon spoke again through her. "Blood of the detective. Blood of the unbeliever. I will carve her soul and feed it to you piece by piece." Emily's body arched, bones cracking audibly as her spine bent backward. Her scream rattled the glass in the windows, but her eyes fixed on Kinderman, eyes that weren't hers anymore, but something ancient, cruel, and endless. This was no longer just a case. No longer just a battle with shadows of the past. This was his bloodline, his legacy, and the demon had wrapped its claws around it. And as the storm raged outside, Kinderman knew the final confrontation had begun. The chapel inside the psychiatric hospital had been unused for decades. The stained glass windows were smeared with grime, their colors muted into lifeless shades of gray. The wooden pews sagged with rot, eaten alive by dampness and time. A faint, suffocating stench clung to the air, incense long decayed, candle wax melted into yellow lumps that looked more like fat than holy offering. Detective William Kinderman stood there, shoulders hunched, feeling the weight of 70 years pressing harder on his bones than ever before. He had thought himself ready. He had thought all his grief had already been wrung from him, after losing his wife, his friends, his faith in pieces too jagged to ever fit together again. But nothing could have prepared him for this. His granddaughter, Emily, her small body lashed to a chair in the center of the chapel, her eyes swollen black with veins that pulsed as if something inside her was clawing to get out. Beside him stood Father Malachi, a defrocked priest with hollow eyes and trembling hands, his collar ripped away years ago but his faith still flickering stubbornly, like a candle refusing to be snuffed. His very presence reeked of desperation, but he was all Kinderman had. "She's not your Emily anymore," Malachi said softly, clutching his cracked rosary so tightly it cut into his palm. "But she can be, if we fight. If we hold fast." From the chair, Emily's head lolled upward. The thing inside her smiled. Its teeth, too many of them, pressed against her gums like shards of glass. Hold fast, yes, it rasped, in a voice layered with her childish sweetness and a guttural rumble that made the chapel walls quake. Hold fast, grandfather. Hold fast to the memory of how she screamed when I entered her, how she begged you in her dreams while you turned away. Kinderman's vision swam. The demon knew. It knew every fragment of his heart. The exorcism began. Father Malachi raised his arms, his voice cracking as he invoked prayers that echoed in Latin, words rolling like thunder through the broken chapel. He demanded the demon to name itself, to retreat, to surrender. The demon laughed. The laughter didn't come only from Emily's mouth, it seeped from the walls, the floorboards, from the broken organ pipes that howled with every word. Candles Kinderman hadn't lit flared alive, burning black. The stained glass windows warped, bleeding colors that ran down the panes like tears. The demon taunted them with 1,000 voices. The voices of the hospital's dead patients. The voices of Kinderman's long-buried friends. And then, worst of all, the voice of Father Marin. William, it croaked, in a perfect imitation. You never believed. You never carried the light. That's why I took her. Kinderman dropped to his knees, his heart hammering so violently he thought it might tear from his chest. He could not tell if this was memory or manipulation anymore. The line between faith and delusion had long blurred. Emily's body contorted violently, her spine arching until it cracked, her limbs jerking with inhuman force against the bindings. Her tongue slithered from her mouth, impossibly long, twitching like a serpent. Her eyes rolled white, then black, then white again. Your God is dust, she hissed. Your prayers are nothing but air. I am older than your faith, older than your pitiful world. I am Pazuzu. And I will birth 1,000 more through this place. The hospital groaned as though alive. Kinderman swore he heard movement in the walls, scraping, clawing, as if hundreds of nails dragged through the foundation. Something was stirring beneath the floors, something vast, a nest of horrors waiting for the final command. Father Malachi shouted louder, forcing every ounce of his soul into the prayers. His rosary split, beads scattering across the floor, rolling into the cracks. His face shone with sweat, his veins standing out like cords. Emily laughed again. You cannot banish me. I have already taken root. Even if you tear me from this flesh, I remain. Her head snapped toward Kinderman. Especially in you. And in that instant, Kinderman felt it. The faint, poisonous tendril of something curling inside his own chest, brushing against his thoughts. It whispered doubts he'd buried long ago, it promised him rest from grief, it promised him reunion with those he had lost if only he would open the door wider. He staggered back, choking, as if the very air were filling his lungs with ash. Fight it. Malachi roared, his voice breaking as he pressed his trembling hand against Emily's forehead. You must not let it enter. But the demon was too strong. The chapel trembled as fissures split the floor. From the cracks seeped a black ooze, thick and bubbling, carrying with it faces, distorted, screaming, dozens of lost souls clawing upward only to sink back down again. Emily's body lifted into the air, strings of flesh stretching from her arms and neck like something was tearing her apart from within. She screamed, not her voice, not her souls, but the sound of thousands shrieking together, layered into a single piercing wail. Kinderman, through his terror, remembered his wife's words, years before she died, don't ever stop loving, Bill. Even when it's impossible. Tears blurred his eyes as he stumbled forward. He pressed his trembling hand over Malachi's and whispered, voice breaking. Take me instead. If you want blood, if you want a soul, take mine. Leave her be. The demon fell silent. Emily's floating body froze. Her head twisted to stare at him, her face a mask of something ancient, hateful, eternal. It smiled. A trade. Malachi screamed. No. That is not God's will. The chapel exploded into chaos. Every candle burst. The stained glass shattered inward in a cyclone of shards, slicing skin, tearing wood, shredding books. The wind carried laughter, low, guttural, mocking. Kinderman's vision blurred as a crushing force slammed into his chest. He fell backward, writhing on the cold floor as the tendril inside him flared into a wildfire. He saw his granddaughter fall limply from the air, her small body collapsing into Malachi's arms. She was breathing. She was alive. But he was not. Not anymore. The demon filled him, splitting him apart, stitching itself into his memories. His veins burned black, his eyes filled with shadow. He tried to scream, but all that came was laughter, the demon's laughter, spilling from his own mouth. The last thing Kinderman saw, before his body stood against his will, was his granddaughter's tear-streaked face whispering his name. And then there was nothing but darkness.